This is ClarkeTheKnife, and this is the Spyderco Bodacious, again, now with Rockscale Design scales. Not only are these some of the best aftermarket knife scales I've handled, but they truly change this knife for the better. I'm not here to waste your time, and I don't want you to waste your hard-earned money, so let's get to the background and the specifications. So this knife here is the Spyderco Bodacious. Here's the version with the Rockscale scales. Here's your original version. The Bodacious is Spyderco's slimmer take on the Shaman, debuted last year. Compared to the Shaman, it's got thinner blade stock, flatter handles, and trade out the finger choil for additional cutting edge. I did a full review on the Spyderco Bodacious if you want to get my full thoughts on that knife. It was far from my favorite knife, but I did at least like it better than the Shaman. These scales here are from Rockscale Design, which I believe is a one-man shop based in Fountain Valley, California. So Rockscale has been making some of the best titanium scales money can buy for Spyderco and Benchmade models for years. I've probably ordered nearly every scale Matt makes at least once, and many of them twice. If you give me a second here, I have got a set of scales right here for my Spyderco Manix, also from Rockscale. Love those scales. Rockscale keeps their design philosophy, actually I'll keep both these out, they keep their design philosophy pretty consistent across their work. So everything that Rockscale does is titanium. That's the only material he works in. Most of his scales, with only a couple exceptions, are flat-sided with rounded edges that are all hand sanded. You can see the same thing here on these Manix scales with a couple chamfers here, things like that. Other than a few limited edition runs, they all have this dark Chris Reeve-esque aluminum blasted finish, meaning they take the titanium and blast it with tiny little aluminum particles, just like a sandblast. And just like a Chris Reeve knife, it takes on plenty of snail trails and other character marks over time. These are pretty new, but if you have an older pair of Rockscale scales, they will start to look more like these here, where you get all those little marks. Now, this model is a new finish from Rockscale, which they call their media wash. So it comes looking basically like this. I've carried this a little bit, but this is pretty similar to how it originally came to me. And what they do is they take this original media blasted finish and then stone wash it afterwards. And that gives it the same matte, slightly grippy feel you get on a Sebenza that's been carried regularly for years. If you've ever owned a Sebenza for a very long time, or frankly any Chris Reeve, or you've handled one that has been carried by the owner for years and years and years, it gets this slightly smooth, slightly grippy, just really nice and satisfying sort of worn down, gritty texture. It's the exact texture that you get here, because honestly, that's exactly what they simulated. They took a blasted texture and then stonewash it to basically simulate a long pattern of wear. This is a very, very cool finish. And there's not a lot of other knives that have this finish out there. It's kind of similar to some things that Shira Gorov does. It's kind of similar to Hinderer's working finish. Kind of similar to some of what Monterey Bay Knives does. But this is just a little different. It's a little slicker, a little smoother, has a little more character than all of those other finishes. It looks really, really nice. Feels nice too. These scales are, let's get the Bodacious back in here, the original Bodacious. These scales are $106. So the stock Bodacious is $225. So that means that this whole knife here with the original knife and the scales is $331. So this is a $331 knife in full here. These are made in the USA. As I said, they are full titanium. They're what's called half liner delete scales. So if you see on this side of the original Bodacious, you can see in there's a full steel liner there. It's milled out, but that whole liner is there. That liner is purely structural. The compression lock is only on this side, so you only need this side for the compression lock. For these Rockscale scales, they eliminated, let's see if we can get it in there. Yeah, they eliminated this, what would be basically the lock side, if this were a frame lock. The liner on this side is gone. Instead, you just got that titanium with heavily milled pockets, which you can start to see there. And then this side still has the liner so that compression lock functions. Because of that liner delete and because of that very aggressive internal milling, this knife only weighs a little bit more. The new one only weighs a little bit more than the stock G10 model. He usually gives a direct weight for weight comparison on his site. He didn't do that here. Yes, could I get out my scale and compare these? I didn't do it. Honestly, by hand, this one feels just a tiny bit heavier if I pick them both up. The scale swapping, if you have never done it before, then swapping the scales, basically turning your stock Bodacious into this Rockscale one, will probably take you about 25-30 minutes. A lot of it because you're just going to be sort of figuring out what to do as you go, making sure pieces go back together properly, things like that. There's a lot of very good videos on YouTube that show you how to do that. And the Bodacious is a lot easier to do than, say, the PM2 because it doesn't have that stupid lanyard plug. Once you've done it a bunch of times, this is honestly a 5-minute scale swap. And half of that is making sure that you're using the right bit for stuff and then probably cleaning out your knife while you're doing it. So pretty easy swap. Onto these, the details of these scales. So the machining on them is immaculate. So same profile as your stock scales, and that's sort of the way that Rockscale does it. Unlike Applied Weapons Tech and some other manufacturers, Titanium, they don't tend to change the overall shape of the scale. So it's pretty much a one-to-one recreation, except with this little index here for your middle finger. The scales fit the knife perfectly. So you can see at the back of the blade here, at the back spacer, at where the screws line up and the pins line up, everything is perfectly flushed. This back spacer is just a little bit recessed, just like it does on the stock scale. The knife is perfectly centered. It looks like it's a little bit off the way I'm holding it here, but it is perfectly centered. Basically, the way that these scales fit the existing liners and the existing blade is darn near perfect, and frankly, a little bit better than the stock scales. And for that, I'll go back to the centering here. So it's not showing up quite right on video, but there you go. There's a good shot. Okay, so my stock Bodacious here, this one sits off center. You can see it's a little bit toward the side with my thumb. And a lot of my Spydercos will sit off center until I start dicking around with them. One of the easiest ways to get a Spyderco knife to center is to get some Rockscale scales for it. I've been recommending over on Reddit and places like that, these Rockscale scales if people have centering issues with their Spydercos for years. Because the machining on these, they're so nice and flat. The tolerances are so tight, they are so nicely machined, that most of the time when you swap out some stock G10 scales or FRN scales, things like that, for titanium Rockscale scales, which are just extremely well made, you will generally find that your blade centers very well. You'll also tend to find that the action gets a little better. I like to run my Spydercos just a little tight. I like them to be sort of smooth and controlled on the open or on the close and still flickable on the open. But you can flick this one shut. It's just because of the little added stiffness of titanium, which matters when you're talking about flatness of the pivot, things like that, and just how nicely these are machined, the action will usually get a little bit better when you swap over to Rockscale scales, and these have been no exception. When you look all around here, every single edge on these scales is nicely knocked down. Apparently, basically the way these are done is the chamfer is done with a machine and then everything is hand sanded on top of that, which honestly is how it feels. There's just, those minute variances in that rounding that makes it look hand sanded. This finish again is very, very nice. It's a blast with a stone wash over top of it, so you get that grittiness, that grippiness of the blast, and then the stone wash just evens it out. It really is very similar to what you get in an older Chris Reeve knife. And then in the hand, because of those nicely contoured edges and because it's the same profile as the Bodacious, It is a very nice knife in the hand. If anything, it is a little bit more comfortable because if you look closely at, say, these edges of the G10 here and compare it to the edges of the Rockscale, you can see the chamfer is a little bit more rounded on the Rockscale scales than on your stock G10. So where the stock G10 can feel a little blocky at those edges, the Rockscale ones just feel more nicely rounded. You combine that with the fact that, you know, titanium just feels nicer, especially when it's this nicely finished. This little index groove here does catch your middle finger, just makes it a little bit easier there. They fit nice in the hand. They look nice, they feel nice, they slightly improve the action, they slightly improve the centering. And frankly, I could probably stop the review there. And I could say, all right, you know, for most people, and most of the time, the question of should you buy these scales really comes down to, is it worth turning a $200 knife into a $300 knife to get a slightly more premium feel, a slightly better action, slightly better centering, slightly just nicer contours in the hand, a arguably more interesting aesthetic? For a lot of people, yes, because there is a strong aftermarket for Spyderco scales, Rockscale included. But that is generally really sort of a judgment call. You know, there's nothing wrong with most Spyderco knives at their stock price that are going to be fixed by aftermarket scales. And none of the stuff, all the stuff that I just talked about here, they're marginal improvements. Slightly better centering, slightly better action, slightly better hand feel. You know, improving things where the Bodacious was already pretty good, but improving those things relatively marginally. But these scales do even more for the Bodacious than most aftermarket scales will do for most Spyderco knives. So if we go back to our stock Bodacious here, I had two major issues with the knife in my review. The first, which aftermarket scales obviously do nothing to fix, is this blade. I just wish it was slicier. You know, they took the stock on the Shaman from 145 down to 125 for the Bodacious. And with that nice tall blade, this should be a really good slicer. This should be an extremely high performer. It's not. They just went kind of shallow on that flat grind, and so it doesn't cut as well as I'd like it to. Aftermarket scales are obviously going to do nothing to fix that. But the other thing that I didn't love about the Bodacious is this is actually a pretty heavy blade still, because even though it's thinner stock, it's 125 thousandths, look at how far that blade stock is taken out. They take that 125 thousand stock all the way out, almost, you know, your saber grind only ends here, and even then toward the tip, it very gradually, you know, slims down toward that tip. And with that much blade stock, especially that much blade that far away from the pivot, this thing feels heavy to deploy, and it feels a little blade heavy in the hand. If you look at your balance point here, which is a pretty inexact measure, it balances right sort of right between where your pointer finger and middle finger land naturally on the knife. For something like a chopper, for something like a big, heavy knife, a blade heavy knife can be very good because it lets sort of, when you're whapping with the knife, it lets the blade do the work. So you'll find a lot of, you know, fixed blades sometimes and a lot of much larger folders deliberately designed in a way that makes them blade heavy. But the Bodacious wants to be an EDC knife. It wants to be a knife that can perform those more agile, more precise tasks. And for that, you really want more of the weight to feel like it's in the handle, because then that makes the knife feel more agile. The more that weight is back toward the butt, the more it feels like your hand is in control of the knife, not your blade. When a blade like the Bodacious can get a little blade heavy, you can just feel like sort of the blades controlling your cuts, and you don't feel quite as connected with that blade as you really could. And we sort of know that this was something Spyderco was aware of as a problem because of what they did with this backspacer. Spyderco usually just does spacers all the way back, but they put this big backspacer on here. I almost am sure to bring more weight back toward the butt of the knife to balance out this big heavy blade. And it's certainly better with that backspacer there than it would have been if they had just used standoffs. It'd be even more blade heavy, but it still is a blade heavy knife in this stock configuration, which is where the Rockscale handles come in. Titanium is a heavier material than G10. The other thing is this G10. G10 is a very light material. A lot of the weight in this handle is actually the steel liners underneath the G10, not the G10 itself. Conversely, because this liner is deleted and because titanium is a heavier material, the weight of these Rockscale scales is more evenly distributed across the whole knife. You know, if you look at these liners here, they, to a lot of the liner, more bulk of the liner has to be up toward the front to, satisfy the needs of the pivot and the compression lock and all that sort of stuff. So this knife gets lighter as it gets back toward the butt. The Rockscale Designs keep their weight pretty continuous all the way to the back because it's the same metal of about the same thickness. Yes, lots of internal milling. That's great. That keeps it light. But if you look at your balance point here, your balance point is a little further back. If I try to get them side by side, this will be a little difficult, but it's a little wiggly. But you can sort of see here where my middle fingers are on the knives. You can see that the balance point on the stock Bodacious is about the width of a finger further forward than the balance point is on the Bodacious with the Rockscale design scales. So the weight of the handle overall isn't that much heavier, but the weight of the handle is more of the weight is further toward the back, and so the knife balances further toward the handle. And the result is that this knife feels so much more natural in the hand. The weight of this knife feels like it is in the handle. This feels like a very comfortable handle-heavy knife. Not handle-heavy, but just more balanced knife. And as a result, this knife feels more agile. I feel like I have more control over the blade. Every single cut that I do with this knife feels easier, feels more effortless, because these scales have changed that weight distribution. It is a subtle change. We're not talking about a dramatic change in the weight of the knife. We're not talking about a dramatic change in the balance point. But it goes from a knife that just has always felt a little awkward to me because the weight is a little too far forward into a knife that feels very well balanced. And that brings me to my overall conclusion with these Rockscale scales. Now, I do like Rockscale a lot in general. I probably bought more Rockscale scales than any other aftermarket maker. Again, I probably bought 12, 13 sets of his scales over the years for both my Benchmade and my Spyderco knives. He has always done excellent work. But these Bodacious scales are something particularly special because of what they do to the knife. This stock Bodacious at $225 is a knife that I am pretty lukewarm about at best. It feels like a missed opportunity. It feels like a knife that isn't quite what Spyderco set it out to be because it does feel a little awkward. It does feel a little ungainly in the hand. And it's a knife that's trying so hard to take the strengths of that Shaman profile and make it an EDC knife. With these Rockscale scales, this is what I wanted the Bodacious to be. This feels like an EDC Shaman. This feels like a very high quality, highly usable knife. Yes, do I still wish that the blade was better performing than it is? Yes, but honestly, the whole knife feels so much better with these new scales on it than it did without them. And so for me, to bring it back to that question, which knife is better? This stock Bodacious for $225 or this upgraded Bodacious for $331? To me, it's not even a question. This is a okay $225 knife. This is a very good $331 knife. And that $100 difference is more than made up in how much better this knife feels. This stock knife, not a keeper for me, would easily move on from the collection. Will move on. I'm literally keeping this around for the sake of making this review. This one very well might be a keeper. And honestly, this Rockscale upgraded one makes me excited again to see what Spyderco might do with the Bodacious going forward. So, if you have a Bodacious, these have my highest recommendation. Go out and get these. Unless you really hate titanium, I think that they are simply make it a better knife, and I really do think you'll love them just as much as I do. This has been Clark the Knife. I'll see you on the next one. Later.